Hi guys, how are you all today morning? Good morning. Today is 6th September 2023. My name is TSV Raghavan and I live in Chennai, Tamil Nadu, India. This is my spiritual vlog on YouTube. Hardan, 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 Haribol, TRSV, Nectar, NECTAR, Nectar. In this particular vlog, in all my previous videos, we have been discussing about the knowledge and information that we have gleaned through the study of spiritual books, scriptures, contemplation on the material universe, and meditation on the spiritual universe. This particular video in this vlog is no exception to that rule. In fact, it is a mere continuation of all that we have been doing in my previous videos. So kindly subscribe to this vlog and press the bell icon so that I may keep reminding you of all my past and future videos for your knowledge, experience, and understanding of both materialism and spiritualism. Now let us continue with the topic of discussion for this particular video in this particular vlog. In the past few videos, we have been discussing about the relationship between the three subtle bodies of a human living entity with the Kundalini serpent and chakras of his or her gross body. By now, we all know that when we individual spiritual souls get in touch with this huge material world, this material world does not appreciate such touch from the spirit soul. In that case, this material world wraps this spirit soul with four layers of its own material body. Of these four, three bodies are layers of subtle bodies, and the fourth layer is known as the gross body. The three layers of subtle body are as follows. The first layer is known as the causal body of intelligence and logic. The second body is the layer of astral mind of feelings and emotions. The third body is known as the etheric body of senses, namely sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Vibrations from these subtle bodies are transmitted to a mass of tissue in the head of the gross body, which forms the fourth layer of the four layers of material body. This material body or the gross body is made up of four elements, namely air, water, fire, and earth. All the four elements are material in nature. So is ether the first element which makes the three subtle bodies of causal intelligence, astral mind, and etheric senses. This ether is the first element of the material world that makes up these subtle bodies. Vibrations begin getting transmitted from these three subtle bodies into that mass of tissue which is a part of the fourth layer of gross body. This mass of tissues is known as the brain and is situated in the head of the gross body of that human living entity. These vibrations begin getting transmitted at the birth of a human living entity in one life and end when this lifetime of this living entity ends after some years, say 75, 80 or more. These vibrations are the contributions of the subtle bodies of causal intelligence, astral mind, and etheric senses to the brain of the gross body. This brain is the conduit or the bridge between the three subtle bodies and the gross body. When these transmissions happen and they are received by this brain, depending upon the involvement, age, sex, experience, knowledge, maturity, destiny, karma, surrounding, atmosphere, and all such factors that pertain to that particular living entity, this brain selects some of these transmissions regardless of whether they are from the etheric body of senses, the astral body of mind, or causal body of intelligence. Once it selects some of these transmissions of vibrations from the three subtle bodies, it begins to chew on them and to masticate them properly to extract the resultant juice out of such vibrations or transmissions. This juice is ultimately percolated down the gross body for the gross body to react according to what quality of juice is percolated down it through the brain. This happens right from the time when the person is born and it ends only when the person ultimately passes on. When a human living entity passes on, the gross body remains in the material world and the subtle bodies go, and though they are alive, they keep floating in the ether till the same living entity is born again in another lifetime. This process goes on and on from the moment this living entity sheds its original identity or forgets its original identity as a spirit soul and dons the identity of a living entity. The moment it does so, it gets into an orbit of endless births and deaths in different species in this material world. This keeps going on and on for times immemorial till one day the same living entity gets liberated from such repeated births and deaths. Before proceeding further, let me remind you that of the three subtle bodies, the causal body of intelligence and logic is closest to the spirit soul, that is, we, the individual spirit souls. The astral body of mind is in the middle, and the etheric body of senses is nearest to the gross body of that particular living entity, whether or not he or she is human or otherwise. The five senses of the etheric body of senses get an outlet into the material world through that particular living entity, through his or her two eyes for sight, two ears for hearing, two nostrils for smell, one tongue for taste, and the complete skin and genitals for touch. This is the process in which the life of a living entity operates in this material world. Here we are trying to analyze the relationship between the three subtle bodies and the subtle imaginary Kundalini serpent of energy and the imaginary subtle seven chakras that are placed at equal distance in the spinal cord of that particular human living entity. Here, before proceeding further, let me remind you that all this relationship also depends on other factors like the three modes of material nature, namely goodness, passion, and ignorance, mentioned in the Srimad Bhagavad Gita by Lord Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, plus the false ego of the same particular living entity, plus his or her evolvement, destiny, experiences, lust, lust, luck, karma, and other such factors. These factors, which are subsidiary, are able to influence the reactions or relationship between the subtle body of that particular living entity and the Kundalini serpent of energy plus the seven Kundalini chakras of that particular human living entity. This said, now we have already discussed a lot about the relationship between these two as an introductory part in our past two or three videos. In fact, I think five. Now, if you see those videos, you will be able to understand how the relationship between the three subtle bodies and the Kundalini serpents and chakras is explained by me in detail in those videos. Here, only to authenticate my theory on this, I would like to give you some examples which will throw the proper light on what I mean to say when I say that there is a relationship between the subtle bodies or the three layers of subtle bodies, their vibration transmitted to the brain of the living entity, the mode of material nature to which that living entity belongs, and his or her false ego. False ego is when a living entity identifies himself or herself with this gross or this complete set of bodies which are totally material in nature. He or she conveniently forgets that he or she was originally a spirit soul. Now, after getting entrapped into the four layers of material body, this particular person has transformed into a living entity, and he or she begins identifying only with this cocoon of material body in which the original spirit soul resides or is entrapped. Only when the living entity gets self realization through contemplation and meditation does he or she finally realize that he or she is not this body but the original spirit soul. The next step in this spiritual journey is that when the same living entity turned originally into a spirit soul begins identifying himself or herself not as the body but as the spirit soul. This spirit soul gets liberated from the repeated births and deaths in this material world only when it sheds those four layers of material body. This is known as liberation. Once the spirit soul gets liberated from this repeated chain of births and deaths, then it becomes a complete, whole, totally evolved spirit soul, and it sheds its initial identity as a raw, immature, unevolved spirit soul. When it gets evolved, the final step for the spirit soul is to be delivered to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In the meantime, let us talk about the three modes of material nature. They are first, goodness, second, passion, and the third, ignorance. All these three modes of material nature are present in every human living entity, whether male or female. However, depending upon his or her destiny, karma, intelligence, evolvement, experience, maturity, tastes, preferences, luck, and other such factors, this particular living entity puts forth one of these three modes of material nature as his or her true nature in the material world, while the other two modes of material nature remain dormant in the psyche of that living entity. To be more precise, a person, a human, a living entity, whether male or female, may put forth the mode of goodness in his or her material nature in a lifetime, but that does not mean that he or she does not have the modes of passion and ignorance deeply embedded into his or her psyche. It is quite possible that someday, due to some circumstances and destiny, karma, etc., one of these modes may get so activated that the goodness mode takes a back seat and the passion or ignorance mode takes the front of that particular living entity. As for example, even in the Hindu mythology, one of the incarnations of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, namely Parashurama, was born a Brahmin, that is, from the goodness mode of material nature. But due to circumstances, he made that nature take a back seat, and his passion was totally aroused and became the friend of Lord Parashurama, and he became what is known as a Kshatriya, whose life and work or karma revolves around passion. Similarly, there is a very renowned sage called Sage Vishwamitra. This man was born a king, and so his actual nature must have been passionate among the three modes of material nature. However, this man meditated and got so spiritual, renowned, and enlightened that he ultimately came to have the front as a person from the goodness mood of material nature, and hence he became the highest form of spiritualism, namely a Brahma Rishi. Similarly, Acharya Drona, the person who taught martial arts to the Pandava and Kaurava princes, was born a Brahmana, but he preferred to give this mood a back seat and instead lived his life and died like a true Kshatriya who comes under the bracket of passion and not goodness. There are several such examples which will tell us that one particular living entity may, whether he or she is male or female, choose to show one mode of material nature as his or her friend in a particular lifetime. Further, there is this thing called false ego. As mentioned before, this false ego makes a person identify himself or herself with this total cocoon of body, this material body of four layers, and not the spirit soul that he or she originally is. These factors are going to affect this particular living entity whose Kundalini we are trying to relate with his or her subtle body. That is the reason why I talked about them in detail in this video. We have already talked about the relationships, but to make them more clear, I would like to delve on a couple of examples which will make this theory more clear and enlighten the viewer furthermore on what I am trying to say. We are initially, as of now, talking only about the first of the six lower chakras, namely the Mooladhara or root chakra and the Swadhisthana or delicious chakra, which form part of the seven chakras that lie across the spinal cord of a particular living entity. Here we would like to see how the relationship between the subtle bodies and the Mooladhara chakra of a particular living entity happen to take place. Example is as follows. Among the Mooladhara chakra, we have to notice that it is closest to the etheric body of senses and its vibrations to the brain of that particular living entity. In other words, the brain of that particular living entity prefers to take the vibrations transmitted by the etheric body of senses to it so that it can chew on them, masticate them, get or extract the juice from them, and transmit it down the gross body of that particular living entity. Because it does so, this particular living entity reacts only accordingly. This Mooladhara chakra is totally physical in nature. Physical means that he or she concentrates only on the gross body among the four layers of, of the material nature that enwrap this particular spirit soul. For this living entity, the fact that his or her gross body is acting as a front for him or her in this material world becomes his or her prime importance or takes prime importance in the psyche of that particular living entity. He or she concentrates only on the gross body when he or she acts or reacts in this material world. Because it is totally physical, this particular living entity uses all his or her basic intelligence, experience, knowledge, and the energy that he or she has gathered through the Kundalini serpent in trying to develop or improve that gross body alone. In that case, he or she focuses only on becoming well built, strong, muscular, attractive, handsome, beautiful, pretty, graceful, etc., so that he or she may be a treat to the eyes of other living entities in this material world. This happens only because he or she is listening only to the etheric body of senses. Example, there are at least 75% of living entities in this society who just concentrate on their physical appearance to impress the general public in this material world, and for that they go through a lot of trials, tribulations, pains, and tears and sweat to look as pretty as possible. This is only according to the etheric senses. These people are satisfied only if they are a treat to the eye of other living entities in this society. This will subject we shall continue in my other video so that we will be able to understand this thing better. It's very important because it will give us a fairly good idea of how the complete life of a living entity works in such a way that his or her destiny, karma, sanchit karma, etc. get shaped up properly in a particular direction. Kindly let me know what you think of what I have talked in this particular video. Please give me your own expert opinions, thoughts, and ideas so that I may blend everything together for the sake of this society. Before concluding, let me remind you that I am also a published author with Amazon Kindle and paperback. I write on spiritualism, fiction, and assorted subjects. Spiritualism happens to be my favorite subject. Till we meet in my next video, it is good morning from TSV Raghavan.